I'm Deborah McKoy. I am thrilled and honored to be here. I am also pretty humbled to be here with this panel. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I am also going to try to keep to time, because especially on a panel with mayors, I'm really eager to hear and learn about all the incredible work happening here today. So, where's that? Let's just, okay. So what I thought I'd do is touch on 3 points in about 15 minutes, and I hope we have more time to continue the dialogue over the next 2 days. First, give you a little bit of sense of what the Center for Cities and Schools is about, and more importantly, what services we offer and information we offer, which I hope will be helpful to you all. Secondly, focus a little bit on kind of the framing of what are we thinking about when we talk about the achievement gap today, and propose possibly a shift in what increasingly is being seen as talking about the problem of the achievement gap or closing the gap to proactively thinking about the opportunity gap, something that everyone in this room really has, I think, a really big stake in changing. And then finally, to report out on some research that we've done over the last few years and kind of laying out what we say the road ahead, or some of the steps that we've seen as most effective across cities across the country in really engaging and partnering with school districts. I'll conclude with some propaganda and events and some things which hopefully will be helpful to you moving forward. Sorry, this should not be complicated. Okay. So the Center for Cities and Schools was started about almost 10 years ago. It's amazing that we're coming up on a decade in September. We're an action, research, or love, think, do tank. We were started between the Graduate School of Education and the Department of City Planning. You know, I started this 10 years ago, and while my professional background is community development and housing, I purposely started the center with a PhD in education in the city planning department, because I think that we often we talk about urban education, but never really understand the implications of urban or metropolitan aspects on our schools. So we very purposely, in talking about place, the relationship of place with schools and education, located it in the place that is solely focused on place, the Institute of Urban and Regional Development. We are an action think tank. We have a lot of resources for you all, covering a broad range of issues that we see are at the intersection of education in cities and regions increasingly. The relationship between education and housing, transportation, school facilities, particularly innovative ways to look at joint use and other joint development strategies, sustainable communities planning and the relationship with schools, and then the final one, which we kind of say is the heartbeat of the center, about really engaging young people in schools critically in the redevelopment and transformation of our cities. So I'll hopefully touch on all of those in my talk today. There are 2 strategies. We not only do reports that we love to do at Berkeley and research studies that go up on a web and maybe somebody reads them, but more importantly, we try to activate and how do we use the information and really partner with folks to use the information. There are 2 key strategies. Both are capacity building strategies, one for adults and one for young people in schools. The adult one has been going for about 8 years. It's called the Plus Leadership Initiative. It's a regional initiative with 7 cities and 5 school districts. And what's evolved is really what people need. It's sort of project-based learning for adults. And city and school leaders come together with a project that they need to work on and get resources and supports from the center, as well as each other, about how to go through it, whether it's housing redevelopment, education, or other changes with transportation or full-service community schools. And what's evolved is a regional learning network where cities are really able to share what's happening, because mobility and the movement of families across these cities is something that's often invisible to everybody but the schools that are dealing with such a turnover often in many of the cities. So a regional learning network has become very important in cross-site, cross-city conversations. The Y Plan is something that I love. I've worked on this, building it out of New York for 20 years. It's an acronym. It stands for Youth Plan, Learn, Act Now. It's also a pun, which is about Y Plan. And it engages young people as an educational strategy now across the country and really thinking critically about cities and innovating cities. We've been a great partner with Tom in Berkeley in a global partnership with Y Plan. And currently, there are over 8 cities that are utilizing the Y Plan methodology. Over 1,000 young people in 2013 engaged in the Y Plan strategy in revisiting, in reimagining and improving their cities. So it's an exciting opportunity, and we have resources available to you should this be something that you're interested in after today. So I just want to step back briefly, a little bit of framing, if you will, about how to think about and how we're thinking about the achievement gap. Traditionally, the achievement gap focuses on sort of the outputs of the school system, kind of the problems that we don't really, that feel intractable, largely driven by test scores. So we have schools that are under-resourced, and they lead to really inequalities in testing outcomes. What a lot of folks around the country are increasingly focusing on, as I said earlier, is more the opportunity gap. The fact that we structure inequality and the achievement gap by not having equal access to the resources and the conditions that enable all young people to do great in school, right, in and out of school. So I think it's important that we really think as leaders in cities about the inputs that go into the system. I think we're making a lot of headway on this. Recently there was a book, kind of a who's who in educational research on closing the opportunity gap. I just want to call to your attention because they really highlight a lot of the key issues happening within the opportunity gap. However, given that the panel was about the achievement gap, I wanted to have one quick slide about what do we know about the trends in the testing inequality in our country right now. NCES, the National Center for Research and Education Statistics, is sort of the go-to place in the country about trends on the testing. So there's a little bit of good news, which is that test scores overall in literacy and math is going up significantly for all populations, including Hispanic and African Americans, is how they gauge the testing. Unfortunately, equally not changing is the gaps. So we still have very considerable gaps in the access. The way they estimate at NCES is 20-point difference or a 2-grade difference in testing outcomes. So it's pretty striking. We've got a lot of work to do in closing that gap. So again, the reframing for the opportunity gap about how do we do that more proactively is a good thing we think is a very important thing to think about. Some of the recent research focuses on some key points, looking at preschool access, and I know many of you have wonderful programs in this as well right now, focusing on preschool access, on resources and having expert kind of learning environments, technology, teachers at home as well as at school. The fact that housing segregation leads to so much of the inequality happening outside and leads to so much of this inequality in testing and academic outcomes. That we really need to meet the needs of language minorities. Language is such a deep issue that we have to understand about inequality in our schools. And increasingly, and I think this is really important, that we're looking at the economic cost of not knowing the relationship between the conditions that structure success in schools, of the relationship between cities and schools. So that's kind of a national overview, and what research is telling us is super important.
I already got it.
I want to focus a little bit more for the last 5 or 10 minutes that I have to talk on what the center sort of niche is coming from a city planning perspective. Because we think it's really an opportunity that's overlooked when we think about educational improvement. And nowhere is there more opportunity to tap into this than in the cities, and many of the cities that you lead. So our shared opportunity today, you have a lot of resources in your binders, and this paper on opportunity-rich schools and sustainable communities that we did a couple of years ago for the What Works Collaborative. It was set up for HUD at the beginning of the administration, kind of a think tank for HUD. And we were asked to not do an academic paper, but really do a how-to guide. So that's what we set out to do. But one thing I will say is, we know this is hard. We know that working across city school lines and county lines is challenging, and that we start off by saying, what are the key obstacles that we need to consider in moving forward? 4 of the key obstacles that come up very often are, we know existing resource inequalities just structures the challenge right up front. The rigid silos, we have cities and schools are separate. I know you don't control what happens inside of schools very often, although it was interesting about Cleveland, it's certainly evolving and changing, but the silos are difficult. Jurisdictional differences is one of the biggest things we hear about. There are some cities, like for Tom, where the city and the school district are the same, But more often than not is in Richmond, California, where you have one city aligned to a school district with 5 cities and 4 incorporated areas. Is that similar to your cities? That's not aligned directly? Yeah, it makes the partnership particularly challenging. Third, limited capacity. We at places like Berkeley are to blame for a lot of the silos out there. We don't train city leaders how to work collaboratively. We are trying to change that with principal training and city planning training about schools, but it still is that there's limited capacity to do it. And then there's historic, deeply rooted tensions and differences, particularly around issues like segregation. Do you do school integration? Do you do neighborhood schooling? We at the center say that both strategies are incredibly important depending on local context. So we're not agnostic, but we say that we need as many resources and solutions as possible to address the very deep inequalities in our schools. So the good news is we surveyed over 75 programs, 75 to 100 programs in collaboration between cities and schools. What we found is that the common denominators about what make effective programs fall along what we call the 7 steps to creating these opportunity-rich schools. I gotta say there are a lot of different steps out there. We've got collective impact and strive with their 5 steps, and again, we're agnostic. I think the important are like, what are the common denominators that create change? I think everyone in this room are experts in many of this, so I'm gonna focus on the implementation stage, which hopefully might be a little different. Briefly, step 1, to know your landscape. A lot of the challenges and partnerships is we take for granted what's happening inside of schools. School schedules can change quickly. School reform strategies can be very different. So again, we need to never assume we know what's happening inside of the schools. Second, planning about engaging early on with schools, with the regions, thinking about different ways to get different sectors together, and then establish metrics. And I think with collective impact, this data is increasingly popular about how to align and get formalized. Implementation, I'm going to spend more time on. Sustaining, of course, if we don't institutionalize the change, it doesn't really matter, right? It's a one-off. So steps 4, 5, and 6 are kind of the meat and potatoes, I think, of collaboration and how we can structure success for more young people. I think we've had the most success nationally with step 4, about really thinking comprehensively about services. We now have over 5,000 schools that are identified as community schools, really recognizing that schools need health centers, that they need recreational after-school programs, college readiness programs. So I think we've made a lot of progress nationally on this area. 5 and 6 are often less on the radar screen: housing, infrastructure, and transportation. A couple of examples about step 4 and comprehensive services. One of the early pioneers in bringing community schools to a district has been Portland, the Sun System. They were very early on to say not just creating community schools in one school, but across the entire county. They found that leads to systemic reform, which I think is so important. More recently, many other districts are looking at how do you really work not just in the school where there are many services there, but across the district. Richmond has been really focusing on full-service community schools at the local level, and now the district, with 5 cities and 4 unincorporated areas, is also looking at systemically how do you integrate this type of comprehensive support across the district. Again, an important move going from the local fantastic innovation in a program to systemic change for far more kids. 5, this housing has been a lot of where we spend our time, and I think that the federal government and other national entities are really incentivizing this relationship between housing and schools much more than ever before. The federal government, choice neighborhoods, for the first time, I think, and I've done work with housing for Hope 6 and back in a lot of housing programs, but for the first time, the Affordable Housing Investment Grants from Choice insist that you actually look at school partnership. So school is now a core part when you think about affordable and mixed housing development. Again, not just an innovative program, but investments that are across the country. An important shift. School facilities is something that is often not as sexy as other parts of infrastructure or in cities, but in fact, they often are the biggest part of a budget and an incredibly important part of making cities incredibly joyful and wonderful places for all families. A small little city in called Emeryville, California, between Berkeley and Richmond and San Francisco, has just broken ground this year in what they call the Emeryville Center of Community Life. And it's the school district working with the city to transform what was a traditional K-12 classroom into a campus, into a civic center. So you have the investment of a civic center and the investment of a K-12 merged together. And it really is some beautiful visions about what's going to happen. Less than 18% of the city of Emeryville send their kids there. And yet the city really saw this comprehensive need to transform what just school campuses should look like and feel like as a big part of their city. So again, a lot of innovation around schools. They're not just amenities, they're a core part of public infrastructure. If I leave you with nothing else, that we can do a lot, even if you don't control school facility funding, there's a lot of innovation that can happen in school facilities. I say that young people are a key part, of what we do in the Bayview as part of Choice Neighborhoods. We engage young people, 4th and 5th, and high school students in the redevelopment through Y-Plan. They come up with a lot of innovative priorities. Safety, just one quick example was young kids wanted tree houses. That really caught the developers by surprise because they think kids want recreational, basketball, but the kids wanted places that were quiet and private. And again, I think those are types of insights that we really need to continue to learn from young people. I'll quickly talk about transportation being a critical part of education. So many kids lose out on first period because the buses don't get there on time. Right? Transportation, aligning transportation to schools, understanding how kids need to get around is happening is really important. We just did a national survey for Denver, actually, for the Mile High Connects program, which maybe you'll touch on, to really think about what are innovations happening. There's a lot of innovation happening. School bus city bus passes, subsidizing bus passes. Boston has a new app that parents can go and look up when their bus is coming. So again, kids can actually get to school in time for first period. Briefly, we've done Y-Plan in Richmond. Kids in Richmond High School did a survey for the city manager. As part of the Health Academy, they did over 600 surveys and had some very interesting insights. Their mayor and the city manager were very happy to hear what the kids wanted. Were actually not that expensive, right? So they were very interested to hear what the young people had to say. I'm going to conclude with saying that all of our evidence and research just really demonstrates it's a win-win strategy. Making the outcomes very clear to all parties is critically important. I have lots of resources to share. We have an event in Denver in 2 weeks on housing, transportation, and education. Lots of flyers on that. We have an event in May on Y-Plan National where 8 cities are coming together here in DC. Young people to talk about how they're transforming their cities. And a new live website last night. I made our web guy get it up for this meeting. On the Y, forget it. Sorry, Tom, it's your presentation here. Help. Can I don't know how to do this, guys.
The other arrow.
Is that? Okay. Anyhow, so it's a new website. It's a public website to share tools. If you're interested in starting to really engage young people in schools in city transformation, we got lots of resources for you. Thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.